Ladies and gentlemen, you heard it all last week from my good friend, owner of Sun Potion Transformational Foods, Scott Lindy, who literally sources the entire globe for the very best superfoods. So keeping that in mind, folks, I ask you to please take advantage of our new coupon code, lowercase Bruce, LA, the LA is uppercase, and save up to 12% on all your purchases at sunpotion.com, or give them a call at 805-798-7356. Again, the number is 805-798-7356. Save now at sunpotion.com. And ladies and gentlemen, that's not the only coupon code available for you, our esteemed listening audience. Did you ever want to own what Bond owns? If so, use coupon code Bruce, LA Talk, and you save up to 10% on all of your purchases at espymall.com. I'm telling you, eSpy Mall provides the very best in CCTV surveillance systems and home surveillance equipment. So save now by simply using coupon code Bruce, LA Talk at espymall.com. Folks, it's fall now. The kiddies have tricked and treated. The ghouls and ghosts are back in their respected tombstones, yet something sinister still lurks in the mist, and that is the 50th anniversary of the JFK assassination in Dallas, Texas, Dealey Plaza, November of 1963. And ladies and gentlemen, this is indeed a special report because the lamestream media, your three-letter alphabet soup media, is still, to this day, pushing the Lee Harvey Oswald did it theory. I mean, seriously, even the plaque at the Texas School Book Depository begs to differ. I mean, the Oswald in Dallas on the day of President Kennedy's murder, November 1963, was one of literally hundreds of Oswalds that the Office of Naval Intelligence provided as patsies, ladies and gentlemen. And it's amazing, folks. I mean, it's incredible the extent that Hoover's FBI went through to label Oswald as a communist. There were various tips to the authorities, I mean, regarding the name Oswald popping up at car dealerships, saying that he was driving like Speed Racer, gloating in public about communist Russia. I mean, fake Oswald's shooting other people's targets at shooting ranges, Oswald's running guns, and even being spotted at the damn Cuban embassy in Mexico. I mean, Oswalds of all different shapes and sizes, folks. I mean, who were they? We will cover this and more on today's broadcast. But seriously, ladies and gentlemen, it's time to wake up. Two of the country's most outspoken presidents were killed by the international bankers. You got Abraham Lincoln, killed for issuing the greenbacks, and Kennedy for ordering the industrial demand of silver coinage, what we have come to know now as Executive Order 11110. The Kennedy assassination was indeed a big event. But ladies and gentlemen, let's get to my guest. I'm honored to introduce a real hero of mine and perhaps the most knowledgeable person on the planet when it comes to the Kennedy assassination, folks. He is an award-winning journalist, veteran Dallas journalist who has worked for several Texas newspapers. He is an investigative reporter. He has also taught courses on the Kennedy assassination at the University of Texas in Arlington. He is the author of best-selling book Crossfire, which was the basis for Oliver Stone's hit film JFK. He was also a technical advisor for the film. Ladies and gentlemen, joining me now is a true hero in the journal business, my good friend Jim Mars. Hello, Jim. How are you doing today?
Hey, Bruce. It's a real pleasure to be with you today. And here we are approaching the 50th anniversary, and we're already getting snowed under with all of these slick publications and TV specials and retrospectives, and they're giving us this usual line about, I guess we'll never know the truth, and well, it's certainly controversial, and People just can't accept the fact that one lone nut can change history, and we need to bind up the wounds and move on, and we hear all these platitudes. But I'm here to talk about the facts of the case, many of which have not been presented to the public, okay? In fact, Bruce, the Kennedy assassination just kind of comes down to your worldview and your belief system, okay?
Right.
If you believe the government and trust the government, then you'll believe and trust the evidence that they present against Lee Harvey Oswald, and indeed, it looks pretty incriminating, okay? Looks like he did it. But if you kind of distrust the government, and after all, they've only lied to us over and over and over again, lied at the end of the tunnel, weapons of mass destruction, no new taxes, the air quality's okay in Manhattan after 9/11. Come on, all they do is lie to us. So if you kind of question their evidence, then you find that it all falls apart, and it was not one lone nut, okay? There was a conspiracy, and whatever this conspiracy was, whether it was Oswald and a friend, or whether it was a vast, deep conspiracy, regardless, it was covered up at the level of the federal government.
Absolutely.
And in fact, I can name two people who legally are guilty in the Kennedy assassination.
Wow.
Okay? And that is Lyndon Baines Johnson and his next-door neighbor and buddy, J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI.
Wow.
Now, wait a minute. Can I prove that Johnson and Hoover were guilty of orchestrating or ordering the Kennedy assassination? No, I cannot. But what I can prove beyond any reasonable shadow of a doubt is that those two men took actions that suppressed, distracted, blocked, blunted any fair and honest investigation into the assassination, and this, under our legal system, makes them accessories after the fact.
That's
okay?
Right.
And we have executed people who are accessories after the fact, because the facts of the case show they didn't kill anybody, but they were there, they knew about it, they didn't turn anybody in, they helped hide the evidence and hide the crime. So they are accessories after the fact, and they're considered just as guilty as the person who pulled the trigger. So in the case of the Kennedy assassination, Johnson and Hoover are guilty.
Wow. I mean, literally, there's so many facts that we have to go through, Jim. Now, let's get right to it. We're talking about the mainstream media, the three-letter media. I mean, they have seriously never compiled enough solid evidence to prove that Oswald did this shooting. I mean, there's literally no evidence, Jim, except the palm print that was found on this Mannlicher Carcano rifle, which, I mean, as you know, easily could have been falsified after Oswald was killed.
Not just easily, it was. Yeah, here, follow this, Bruce. On the Monday night following the Friday assassination, the Henry Wade, the district attorney of Dallas, just happens to hold a press conference, and then towards the end of it mentioned, oh, by the way, have I mentioned we have his fingerprints on the gun? Well, that pretty well cinched it in everybody's mind. Fingerprints on the gun? Well, obviously he must have done it. But wait a minute, let's look at this closer. So here again, if you just accept the government's evidence at face value, that looks pretty incriminating. But let's look at it closer. That Friday night of the assassination, quite illegally, because at that time there was no federal crimes about assassinating the president. It was a Texas homicide.
Right.
And by Texas law, they had to have an inquest. They had to inquire as to what had happened. But no, they didn't get to do that because Kennedy's body was illegally, unethically taken out away from the Dallas authorities and sent to Washington, along with all of the evidence in the case. Okay? And so on the next day, there's an FBI report issued, signed by J. Edgar Hoover himself, which stated that no usable fingerprints were found on the rifle or even the inner parts of the rifle. Mm-hmm. On Sunday, we know the rifle was sent back to Dallas, and on Monday morning it was taken over to the Miller Funeral Home where they're preparing Oswald's body for burial, and two FBI agents, Vincent Drain and Harrison, took the rifle over to the funeral home. And the funeral home director, Paul Grudy, told me years ago and said quite recently publicly that he was there when they put Oswald's dead hand on the rifle.
Oh, man.
And he said he had a hard time getting the fingerprint ink off of Oswald's dead hand in time for the burial that afternoon. And it was that night that they said, oh, we've got his fingerprints on the rifle. Now, I ask you, you know, does that seem like that was legitimate evidence? No.
Not at all. It seems completely fabricated. I mean, let's talk about Hoover and his involvement in this. I mean, he stated that basically that they fired those shots from that rifle from the depository on the 6th floor within 5.6 seconds, right? A manual bolt action rifle. And he was saying that the leaves had fallen off, which they probably fell off in May from what I've heard, and it was November. So, I mean, there's no way, Jim, that they could have shot the president from that angle with the trees in the way, which they were,
right,
and Hoover said they weren't.
Keep leaves stay there.
Right.
And hey, on top of that, the Army's Ballistic Test Center, which evaluated the rifle, said, and I'm quoting, well, they could not sight the weapon in using the telescopic sight, and we did adjust the sight by the addition of 3 shims, which tended to adjust, and the one what adjusted the elevation. So in other words, the telescopic scope was misaligned. You couldn't have hit anybody with it, okay? And the Warren Commission even thoughtfully shows us pictures of the 3 metal shims that they had to put under the telescopic sight on that rifle just to make it accurate enough to test.
Wow.
And yet he was supposed to have hit a moving target, moving downhill laterally away from him with a tree intervening in the line of sight, and yet hit 2 out of 3 shots within 6 seconds. No way.
Outrageous.
Just no way.
You know, like Senator Long would have said, that dog don't hunt, right?
That's right, exactly. And anybody who knows firearms knows it doesn't work. Now you can if you're working, if you know the rifle well and you've practiced with it some, you can probably squeeze off about 3 rounds in 6 seconds. That's the max you can do, and then you're firing as fast as you can.
Right.
And you have to cock the bolt and then pull the trigger. Even the FBI testified that it takes 2 seconds just to cock the bolt and pull the trigger on that rifle. So 3 shots, 6 seconds, 2, 4, 6. There you go.
Wow.
Now, the problem is that doesn't leave any time for regaining your sight, you know, especially if you're trying to look through the telescopic sight. Get a pair of binoculars, look out over a football field, pick out some neat-looking person across the way, and then hand it to your friend, tell them, hey, look at that chick, or look at that guy, and then you get the binoculars back. Do you automatically go back and automatically look at the same guy? No, you have to hunt around for him, find your sight picture.
Exactly.
And you'd have to do the same thing with a scope.
Oh, you're absolutely right. Yeah, that's just no way. I mean, that we heard that was a Japanese scope, so it was defected probably, which it was. You just said it was. I mean, there's just no way in hell he could have done that shooting from there.
Well, the sight, the telescopic sight, believe it or not, cost more than the rifle.
You gotta be kidding me.
Cheap piece of junk.
Exactly. No, but Jim, seriously, there is an obvious lack of evidence in the case against Oswald. But moving on, Jim, it's my belief that over 51 people reported shots coming from behind the grassy knoll. Now, let's go through some of those witnesses, starting with Lee Bowers Jr. Tell our listening audience about who Lee Bowers Jr. was.
Well, Lee Bowers Jr. was a railroad switchman. He was stationed in a tower that's set behind the school book depository building by the railroad tracks there, which were used for switching some of the trains. And it's up about 15, 20 feet in the air. And from his vantage point, he was able to see behind the picket fence on the grassy knoll area. And he said, number one, that right just before the shooting, that a couple of cars without a state license plates and mud all over them like they'd been on the road for a while came cruising back into that parking area, and that both times they had their hand up to their mouth like they were talking on the walkie-talkie or listening to something. Mm-hmm. And then he said about the time the motorcade came by, he saw it enter the plaza, but then because the road dips down, he could not see what was happening on Elm Street, but he could see behind the fence, and he said there were some people back there, and that something caught his eye.
Right.
Something attracted his attention. And, of course, when he tried to tell this to the Warren Commission, they just led him off in another area and wouldn't let him finish as to what he saw. But later, in a filmed interview, he said he saw a flash or a puff of smoke. Something caught his attention from behind the fence on the grassy knoll. Now, this is what really gets me, right, Bruce, is that we've got his testimony that said he saw something happen behind the fence on the grassy knoll, a flash, a puff of smoke, and men standing back there. The majority of witnesses down in that west end of Dealey Plaza said the shots came from behind the picket fence on the grassy knoll. Railroad workers who were standing on the triple underpass said the shots came from their left over there behind the picket fence on the grassy knoll. We have two separate sets of acoustical scientists who testified to the House Select Committee on Assassinations that at least one shot came from behind the picket fence on the grassy knoll. And then we have a photograph of a man in a rifle firing position with a dark shirt on, some kind of semicircular patch on his shoulder, with a bright spot in front of his face, either from smoke or flash from a rifle. So we have a photograph of a man firing behind the fence on the grassy knoll. Now, if this was any other case, based on all of that, if I tried to tell you there was nobody on the grassy knoll, you'd think I was an absolute idiot. But this is the Kennedy assassination, and despite all of this evidence to the contrary, they still try to say there was nobody on the grassy knoll.
Oh, you
it's
gotta
just
be kidding
insane.
me. You know, and it's a case of the Fox investigating the chicken coop. I mean, you got Allen Dulles, former director of the CIA, and a lot of people may know this. Of course, you know this, Jim, but he was fired by Kennedy. You have Earl Cabell and his brother, who was probably the only one. That's why they say, oh, the mob did it. No way. The mob didn't have, like Jim Garrison said, the muscle to pull something like this off. I mean, yeah, you had the Teamsters and Hoffa all pissed off at the Kennedys, but there's no way. I mean, Jack Ruby was basically just the mob's water boy, right?
Right. Well, and now you just put your finger on the key to the whole thing, because everybody wants to know, well, who killed Kennedy? Who pulled the trigger? Well, I'm here to tell you, it doesn't matter, okay?
Right.
Because anybody could have killed him. As rogue CIA agents, KGB agents, Castro agents, anti-Castro Cubans, okay, the military, anybody.
So many enemies.
Even the lone nut could have killed him. The question is, who had and still has the power to keep it covered up at the level of the federal government of the United States? And I submit to you, only people at the highest levels of the federal government of the United States.
Wow.
Castro couldn't have done that. Khrushchev couldn't have done that. Some mob chieftains couldn't have done that. Rogue CIA agents couldn't have done that.
No way.
No. This was a coup d'etat. This was a palace revolt, and it was carried out as a public execution for the same reason that we publicly execute criminals, to serve as a deterrent to anyone who would think about following in Kennedy's footsteps.
Wow.
So we have to stop and look at what was Kennedy doing that angered and alienated some of the most powerful and violent forces in this country.
That's right.
Well, he was going to pull out of Vietnam. There's really no question about that. He never would have allowed the introduction of ground combat troops, even though he did increase the military advisors there for a time. But then in early November, he even ordered that 1,000 military advisors be withdrawn.
That's right.
But that pullout order was stopped on the Monday following the Friday assassination by a National Security Action Memorandum signed by Lyndon Johnson. Now, what's really interesting is that I have a draft of this National Security Action Memorandum 273 issued by Johnson, and it was prepared on November the 21st, 1963, the day before Kennedy was killed. So somebody knew that he wasn't going to live to carry out his pullout order in Vietnam. And then, as you've also mentioned, in June of '63, issued $4.2 billion in United States notes rather than Federal Reserve notes. And the difference being that we didn't have to pay interest on the Treasury notes. And that was, again, that was the second time that a U.S. president had bypassed those international bankers. The first being Abraham Lincoln, when he issued greenbacks to finance the war between the states, and then Kennedy in June of '63. And Bruce, I don't think it's just a coincidence that both of those presidents were shot in the head in public.
Not at all, Jim. Not at all. And let's go back to the grassy knoll. I mean, 51 people reported. 51 people were witnesses, reported shots from that grassy knoll. Let's talk about Jean Hill. She was there with her friend. She had a bird's eye view of the carnage. She was basically snatched away by feds, right?
Right. Yeah, she said she was taken by men in suits who took her to the upper story of the sheriff's office, which is overlooking Dealey Plaza, and she was up there. She was questioned, and some of these questions included, "Why did you jump back up on the curb?" Mm-hmm. And she said, "Well, I heard a noise and it startled me." And the other question was, "Why did you run across the street? And what did you expect to see?" So anyway, just by the sheer nature of these questions, if Jean Hill is to be believed, and I believe her, that means that federal agents were in the upper stories of the sheriff's office building monitoring and watching the assassination.
Right.
And yet, officially, there were no Secret Service agents on foot in Dealey Plaza. They were all riding in the motorcade or were already at the Trade Mart where Kennedy was to deliver a speech once he got there. So who were these guys? In fact, if that's not weird enough, then there were other people, including Dallas police officers, who encountered men in suits who flashed them identification and said, "Secret Service, everything's okay back here," and directed them away from that area behind the grassy knoll. Okay? So now, who were these people impersonating Secret Service agents? Or were they real Secret Service agents that are not part of the public record? We don't know, but it needs to be investigated.
Absolutely.
But like so much else in this case, the Warren Commission and then even the House Assassinations Committee, they all started with a preconceived and a predetermined conclusion, which was Oswald did it all by himself. Now, how can we prove this? And they began to cherry pick the evidence that would support that conclusion. And this bothers me a lot, Bruce, because as we all know, Oswald was recorded on sound and film in the Dallas police station crying, "Well, I didn't shoot anybody, I'm just a patsy."
Right.
Well, that means that he's saying, "I've been set up to take the blame for this crime." Now, you would think that in a fair hearing, they would at least say, well, the suspect said he didn't do it, he was set up. Is there any evidence to indicate that he might have been telling the truth? No, they never even consider it. And yet there's plenty of evidence. We've already mentioned some of it, the fact that the palm print turned up late, the fact that initially they said they only found 2 shell casings, and then later all of a sudden a third one turned up because they had to have 3 shots.
Right.
And then, of course, by 3 shots, FBI director originally said there were 3 shots, and the first shot hit Kennedy in the back, second shot hit Connolly, second shot hit Kennedy in the right side of the head and killed him. That's a fairly believable scenario. The problem was, though, they didn't take into account James Tague. James Tague was also wounded in Dealey Plaza. He was standing down near the triple underpass when a bullet hit the curb near his feet and threw up bits of metal and concrete and nicked his cheek and caused there was a little bit of blood on his cheek. And he actually made it into a police report and a deputy sheriff report of that day, though not by name. So he began to write to the Warren Commission saying, well, hey, I was also wounded in Dealey Plaza, and I'd like to tell my story. And they ignored him. They weren't even going to listen to this. But then a assistant U.S. attorney in Dallas wrote a letter to the Warren Commission and includes the photograph of the bullet mark on the curb and said, hey, what about this bullet? And at that point, with an official letter from an assistant U.S. attorney, they couldn't ignore her. So all of a sudden they start paying attention to Taig's story, and now they change the whole scenario that one bullet missed and nicked James Taig by hitting down near the triple underpass, right. And the last bullet hit Kennedy in the head. And the first bullet went through both Kennedy and Connally, caused all their wounds to two separate men, and then emerged pristine, as they called it, unscathed, and was found on a stretcher at Parkland Hospital.
Wow.
And that became the single bullet theory, or more aptly described as the magic bullet theory.
Right.
Because under the magic bullet theory, you've got a shot coming from 60 feet in the air at a downward trajectory, strikes Kennedy in the back at the level of the third thoracic vertebra, does not strike any bone, but somehow courses upward through his body and exits out as Adam's apple at his throat in front, and then twists in midair and goes back down to strike Connally in the back near the right armpit, shatters his fifth rib, exits his right chest, enters his right wrist and shatters that wrist bone, and then ends up in his left thigh, and then supposedly works its way out of the room and was fortuitously found on a stretcher at Parkland Hospital. Now, what a cockamamie,
Jim, that's
conspiracy theory that is.
That's got to be the craziest bullet, like Jim Garrison said again, in the history of all combat, right? I mean,
right.
Never has there been a bullet like that, ever.
Well, and Governor Connally, who was also wounded, gives a lie to that whole scenario because he said he heard the first shot. Well, that shot is a supersonic missile. It hits you before the sound reaches you. Uh-huh. So it's an old axiom of combat that you never hear the shot that gets you. Okay, so he said he heard a shot. Wow. And he was turning to see if he could get a look at Kennedy when he was hit in the back. Okay, that was the second shot. And then he said as he fell into his wife's arms, he heard other shots and thought to himself, somebody's using an automatic rifle. Well, if there's only one other shot, you're not going to think that's an automatic rifle. Uh-huh. There was a fusillade of shots that came into that car. In fact, the acoustical scientist told the House committee that there was as many as 10 sounds on the Dallas police dictabelt that they could not rule out as being gunshots. Since they only test fired from the sixth floor and from behind the picket fence, they could only say with any certainty that shots came from those two locations. But if they'd test fired from other locations, they might have been able to say that they came from even other locations. Incredible.
Now, Jim, we talked about LBJ being implicated in this, and he certainly, he received like about $1 million from some type of bank shortly after Kennedy's death, but more notably, he ordered that the Lincoln be wiped down. Eliminating all possibilities of getting the gun trajectory, the ballistics, of where those bullets indeed came from, right, Jim?
That's true. They started cleaning up the presidential limousine at Parkland Hospital. Right. There's pictures of the buckets of water, and they're washing it all down. That's destruction of evidence.
Exactly.
And Johnson and the people in Washington should have known better. Okay, but no, that's destruction of evidence. And then, as you said, Johnson had the car armored and rebuilt and repainted, and that again before there was any ballistic examination of the car. That's tampering with the crime scene. That is a criminal offense. Okay,
that's right.
But this was all done at the federal level, and there was nobody to say, "Hey, you can't do that. Stop that. That's destruction of evidence." There's so many instances that the Dallas police evidence sheet, as presented by the Warren Commission, shows 3 shell cases found. But the original Dallas police evidence sheet that I got out of the Dallas police files only showed 2 spent cartridges found. And at the bottom it said paraffin test on Oswald was positive on both hands, negative on the face. Right. And when you read the actual report, by putting paraffin on his cheek and on his hands, They were determined that there were some traces of nitrates on his hand, but no gunpowder. Okay, and yet there were no gunpowder or nitrates on his face. Well, I can assure you, if he had fired that old loose bolt Mannlicher Carcano 3 times in 6 seconds, the only way he could have done that would be to hold it in the rifle firing position and pull the bolt back and crank the bolt that way. And if he had done that, believe me, his cheek would have been sprayed with exhaust gases and nitrates and gunpowder. So it's pretty good evidence that he did not fire a rifle that day. And are you ready for this? You would think that one of the first things that Dallas police would do when they got hold of that rifle was to simply test to see if it had been fired recently.
Right.
But they didn't do that, apparently, or if they did, there's no record of it. Then it got taken away from them before they could even do it.
Right.
You know?
They made a public exhibition of the rifle. Instead of
right.
taking it in, for forensics, they made a circus exhibition out of it.
That's true. That's true. But I have to defend the Dallas police to a certain extent because in many instances they did the right and proper procedures in a homicide case like this, but all too often they were overruled and pressured by federal officials.
I believe that.
That's the tip-off to this whole thing. Again, we're back to if you trust the federal officials, then, they were simply trying to get to the truth, and Oswald did it all by himself. But if you have the slightest suspicion about those federal officials, then, it all takes on a different look.
Amazing. Jim, there are seriously so many ties, so many people that have benefited from covering up the Kennedy assassination. Let's talk about another one of those people who is not dead yet, George Bush Sr. Let's talk about his involvement in the conspiracy to kill Kennedy. He was actually on scene there as a young CIA agent. But tell us about George Bush Sr. and his ties to Zapata Oil. But more than that, this man, George de Mohrenschildt. Did Bush know George de Mohrenschildt? I mean, this is the man that linked Oswald to that Mannlicher Carcano rifle.
Yeah, the last known close friend to Lee Harvey Oswald was George de Mohrenschildt, and in George de Mohrenschildt's personal directory, we find George Herbert Walker Poppy Bush. He had his nickname in there, gave his home address in Houston. Yes, I'm sure they knew each other, and quite well. And it does seem there is considerable evidence to indicate that Bush was in Dallas at the time of the assassination. There are those who claim that he was photographed, the young George Herbert Walker Bush, standing outside the schoolbook depository. And I'll admit there is a person there that looks an awful lot like him, but I'm not going to convict somebody on one photograph of somebody kind of in the background.
Not enough proof.
But
proof.
There's other things too. The next day there's an FBI report saying that giving an account of a George Bush with the CIA who had given some reports on the reaction of the anti-Castro Cuban community to the assassination.
That's right.
This came out during the election back in the 90s when Bush was elected president, and they quickly said, oh, no, that was another George Bush, and so the mainstream media dropped it. But later they actually found this other George Bush, and he said he had been a low-level analyst working in the Northeast, and he had no connection whatsoever with the anti-Castro Cubans. So is there any evidence that George Herbert Walker Bush may have been connected to the anti-Castro Cubans? And the answer is yes. I'm still in touch with a former CIA contract pilot who was flying arms and ammunition for the Bay of Pigs invaders, and he said that some of this was going under the guise of oil field equipment from Zapata Drilling. Well, of course, by the time Bush got to be president, everybody knew he was a Houston oil man. So I gave this guy a little trick question. I said, oh, yeah, that's Zapata Oil out of Houston, Texas, right? He went, nope, that was Zapata Drilling out of Midland, Odessa, which is exactly correct. That's what it was back in the early 60s. So now we find that Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush, was involved with the CIA long before he was made CIA director in 1975. Okay? And it even gets better because he had Zapata drilling, and guess what the code name was for the Bay of Pigs invasion? Operation Zapata. All right? And the two ships that were involved in the Bay of Pigs invasion were the Houston and the Barbara. Hello? And so, yes, I think that answers a big question I've always had, which was back in the mid-'70s when Gerald R. Ford, our only unelected president, nobody got to vote for him for president. He was appointed president, named president by Richard Nixon, with the agreement that he would absolve Nixon of all crimes, past, present, or future, which he did. And then he appoints George Herbert Walker Bush as head of the CIA. And even at the time, I was thinking, well, wait a minute, why do they reach down into Texas to find some oil man and put him in charge of the CIA? Well, if you do your homework, you find out that it was Bush's father, Prescott Bush, who, as a powerful senator from Connecticut, helped create the CIA, right. And that George Herbert Walker apparently had these connections with the CIA and through the anti-Castro Cubans and through the Bay of Pigs invasion for a good number of years before he was named head of the CIA. So it all makes sense once you understand his involvement.
Absolutely, Jim. Now, speaking of the anti-Castro Cubans, many people believe that Lee Harvey Oswald was a double agent. It definitely looks like he was a double agent. I mean, going 2 weeks before the Kennedy assassination to speak with a special agent Hosty. But many people believe that he did infiltrate this right-wing Cuban organization. A lot of people believe they're known as Operation Mongoose or Operation 40, but a source told Jim Garrison, the district attorney, the only person to take this to court, that indeed they were running, it was Operation Mongoose that was being run to kill Fidel Castro. The same guys that were trying to kill Fidel could have whacked Kennedy. Am I correct?
Yeah, exactly. And that's very important too, to understand how that held together. Mongoose was right there at the center of the whole thing, and Mongoose was a nexus point for anti-Castro Cubans, for the CIA, the FBI, the U.S. military. And they were all mixed up in Operation Mongoose, which was the secret war against Castro.
Absolutely.
And it's been shown through various committees, such as the Church Committee and others, that this included assassination plots. They were going to kill Castro. And apparently what happened was they decided that the real problem was not in Havana, it was in Washington, and so they simply sent their hit teams to Dallas. And since it suit everybody's purposes, that everybody went along with it. And yes, indeed, Oswald obviously was playing both sides of the street in some sort of intelligence game, because when he was in New Orleans, one day he's handing out pro-Castro literature on the street corner, and the next day he had a Marine Corps manual, and he was at the business of one of the leaders of the anti-Castro Cubans, offering his services and offering to train people to go fight against Castro. So he's playing both sides, and that's because he was a low-level intelligence agent, just as his mother always claimed. She was not the crazy lady that the media portrays her as being. Right. I spent a lot of time with Marguerite Oswald, and contrary to the popular opinion, which is she was just a crazy old woman who just blindly was supportive of her son, no, in fact, she told me on several different occasions that she could accept the idea that her son killed the president if they would just prove it to her. Well, they never proved it to her, and they never proved it to me, and they never proved it to a good number of serious researchers over the years.
Absolutely not. I don't think they can prove this travesty, this farce.
No, because the case against Oswald, when there is not obvious falsification or fabrication or suppression of evidence is based on assumptions and hypothetical situations. You know, if this and if that, if this lined up here, and if somebody said this, and if somebody was over here, and it all lined up here, could this happen? Well, yeah, I guess maybe it could. Okay, well, that's what happened. Well, that's not any way to conduct an investigation.
Absolutely not. Let's move forward, Jim. Let's talk about the hobos that were at Dealey Plaza. They were detained by the Dallas PD. They were never. The notes from their questioning were never kept. The photos were never published. Who were these guys, Jim?
Well, that's a good question. Years later, in fact, back in the early 90s, when they opened up the Dallas police files, all of a sudden there's 3 arrest reports, all written in the same hand on the same day.
Right.
You know, in other words, obviously somebody just sat down and filled out all 3 of these reports all at the same time, and they identified these guys as 3 hobos. And then, of course, everybody's going, well, where are they? One of them was apparently had died, but they found 2 of these guys, and they said, oh, yeah, that's right, I was arrested in Dallas on that day, you know, so they tried to put that one to bed. And yet there is discrepancies all through this account, and I think, now I'm venturing into theory here, but I do theorize that the guys they found were indeed hobos, were indeed arrested in Dallas that afternoon, but I do not believe that they were the same ones they pulled off the railroad car and marched through Dealey Plaza and had their pictures made, okay?
Right.
I think there was a time difference there that's been used to obfuscate that particular issue. So it's still kind of up in the air as to who these so-called bums were that were pulled out of the railroad cars. And what's even more intriguing is that in one of the photographs they are passing, there's a cop in front of them and a cop behind them, but they're several paces before and behind. One of them has a shotgun that's just cradled in his arms. He's not carrying it in a ready position, and they're just strolling along with these guys under arrest. It's obvious that they're not expecting them to give them any trouble, and it's more like they're escorting them.
Exactly.
And they just move on out. And in one of the photographs, they're passing a man in a suit, which a general and Colonel and one of the colonels who was connected to the Pentagon, Colonel Fletcher Prouty, he said this was General Lansdale. He was the head of Operation Mongoose. And they say he was there walking past the 3 tramps under arrest in Dealey Plaza at the time of the Kennedy assassination. That needs serious investigation. But no, nobody's ever looked at that.
Absolutely not.
And so it just really bothers me that so much has not been reported accurately to the American people. They're just told Oswald did it all by himself. That's the end of that. Don't listen to any conspiracy theories. You know, excuse me, Oswald did it. It's a conspiracy theory. They don't have any proof of that. Even the Dallas police chief,
and
Jesse Curry, he said we could never put him in that window with that rifle.
And Jim, who came up with the term conspiracy theory? The same man that was running conspiracy theorist, the same man that was running Operation 40, Richard Nixon, under the Eisenhower presidency.
Yep, and then that was taken up by officials within the CIA who had for years used that the term conspiracy theorist, you know, as a degradation for anyone who would try to offer some alternative idea to the official position. And it worked pretty good for a while, but if there's anything good at all to come out of the attacks of 9/11, it's the fact that the term conspiracy theory got rehabilitated, okay?
Oh, wow.
Because there's no question that 9/11 was a conspiracy, all right? It's the only question now becomes is whose conspiracy was it? That's another whole subject.
Now, Jim,
but
going back to
now
those...
you can talk conspiracy theory and everybody doesn't automatically sneer at you.
Jimmy, going back to those hobos, do you believe that the Watergate burglars E. Howard Hunt and Frank Sturgis, who was believed to be a member of Operation 40, do you believe they could have been those hobos that were strolling along Dealey Plaza? Kind of looks like
no, I've studied that quite closely, and although I do believe there's good evidence to indicate that a hunt was in Dealey Plaza as well as some of the other anti-Castro Cubans. They were at other places. And also, I'm not sure that makes them guilty in the assassination, because it seems obvious to me that
they were bench
Dealey
warmers.
Plaza on November the 22nd, 63 was kind of a gathering place, for spooks from all over the place.
Right.
CIA, FBI, Mossad, KGB. I think they were all there to watch what was going on.
Okay.
And I think that's another thing. You have to understand the cover-up in the Kennedy assassination, which is there was never a cover-up in the classic sense, meaning that there was a lack of information. It's quite the opposite. The cover-up has been an obfuscation. They put out claim and counterclaim, charge and countercharge, one expert against another expert, one medical, official and against another one, to the point to where most people just go, "Oh man, this is confusing. It hurts my head. I don't want to hear anymore."
No kidding.
So they kind of turn off to it. But that's been
overload.
the cover-up. There's not been any real cover-up, because a lot of this information, that some of the things you've mentioned, some things I mentioned, these are factual matters. These are not conspiracy theories.
Right.
The conspiracy theory is that Oswald did it all by himself. That's a conspiracy theory.
You got it. And Jim, I think it's just hilarious. Again, we're almost short on time, but I think it's funny. I watched Frost Nixon, and I hear Nixon talking about hush money to E. Howard Hunt, and then I watch E. Howard Hunt's deathbed confession stating that he was a bench warmer, and then I look at the book Bimini Run, and it kind of parallels Frank Sturgis's paramilitary fiascos in Miami or whatever terrain they were trying to simulate this Cuban invasion. I mean, it's all just smoke and mirrors, at one point. But wow.
Well, now there is a picture of a guy that looks incredibly like E. Howard Hunt strolling across Elm Street, along with all these people that were rushing up the grassy knoll where they thought the shots came from, and he's wearing a trench coat, and he's got his hat, and his son looked at this picture, and he said, "That's my dad."
Yeah.
And he said, "And I recognize that trench coat. That's the trench coat he wore all the time."
Absolutely.
So, yes, I think that E. Howard Hunt was probably on hand, but I don't think that he was one of the three tramps.
Okay, gotcha, Jim. Now, Jim, we're almost short on time, but I have to ask you, you taught courses in UFO. Tell our listening audience a little bit about those courses, and tell us about that UFO talk, that rumored pillow talk between JFK and Marilyn Monroe, which could have resulted in both of their deaths as well, right?
That's true. In fact, that could have been, I think there were the three main elements that collectively broke the camel's back, so to speak, and prompted the Kennedy assassination. I think, there were lots of things he was doing, such as the Kennedy Tax Act and, trying to strengthen the private banks and trying to curtail powers of the international corporations. He's doing all kinds of things to hack people off, as well as his support for civil rights. But I think the three things that really pushed him over the edge was, number one, Vietnam, the fact that he had indicated he was all set to pull out. He said make no formal announcement of it, so it was incumbent upon him to get him before there was a formal announcement, because if he had made a formal public announcement that he was withdrawing from Vietnam and then he got killed and then we went into Vietnam, it would have been very obvious to everyone what was going on. So they had to get him so they could continue with their Vietnam War that they wanted. The second thing is the money, the fact that in June of 63 he issued $4.2 billion in United States notes, which is non-interest-bearing money. That was really big. And then the third thing is really wild, which is that there is a document showing that in the fall of 63, Kennedy had ordered the head of the CIA to turn over to the White House all their files on UFOs.
Right.
Now, that's the deepest, darkest secret we've got. And I'm sure they realize that if they were to turn over all that they knew about UFOs to the White House leaks like a sieve, and it would have been tantamount to making that public. So they couldn't afford to do that. So he gave the head of the CIA a deadline of February the 1st, 1964. And, of course, he didn't make it to that date, and nothing happened and nothing has come out. But it is interesting, too, because according to FBI reports, they were monitoring the phone of one of Marilyn Monroe's close friends, and they picked up a conversation with her where she was saying that she felt like she had been jilted by the two Kennedy boys and mistreated, and that she was mad, and that she was going to call a press conference here in the summer of 1962, and she was going to reveal things they had told her. And one of the things was the fact that there were missiles, offensive missiles in Cuba. You know, this was months before we had the Cuban Missile Crisis. There was a few other little goodies in there, but the number one thing she mentioned was how Kennedy John had told her he had visited a secret air base and viewed things from space.
Wow.
Okay? Now, is there any evidence that that happened? Yes, there is. There were people who worked at Area 51, a secret air base at the time, and still pretty secret, and who said that in the fall of 63, Kennedy made a visit out to Area 51, and early on, these people who reported this said they were in the community lunchroom there, and they heard people talking and say, yeah, the president's coming, but don't worry, we're not going to tell him anything. We just tell him there's nothing here, you know. And yet later after the visit, they were really upset, and they said Kennedy got very angry and was threatening to cut their budgets.
Wow.
And that's because apparently he knew the truth. And I say that because there is a government report from 1947 talking about the crash in Roswell, New Mexico. And back at the back of this report, it says one of the few members of Congress to know the truth about all this is Representative John F. Kennedy of Massachusetts, who apparently had a source close to the Secretary of the Air Force.
Wow.
So back in 47, Kennedy knew the truth of what crashed in Roswell, and when he became president and they tried to give him the song and dance about, oh, nothing at Area 51, you know, he knew better.
Wow, Jim. Amazing interview. We're out of time. We got you linked up at montalvoreport.com. Give our listeners your website so they can check out your amazing books, your amazing work. Thank you, Jim, for being on the show, and I look forward to bringing you on again, man. Thank you so much, sir.
Okay, well, thank you for the opportunity to try to set the record straight. And if everybody wants the full details, you can get it in my new updated version of Crossfire, the plot to kill Kennedy. And you can find that at my website, jimmars.com. That's Jim, MARRS.com. And plus, you can get the book at Amazon or any bookstore.
Thank you so much, sir. Look forward to talking to you again. Thank you, Jim. Bye-bye. Ladies and gentlemen, that was legendary veteran Dallas journalist Jim Marrs. Unfortunately, we're out of time. You've been listening to the Bruce Montalvo Show.